I guess I don't have an opinion because I don't think we needed the billet block for power reasons.
Yeah.
But the billet block, from what I understand, 70 pounds lighter. So it's actually the cheapest weight reduction mod
Wow.
we've done on the car in a long time.
Welcome along to the Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and on this episode, we've got Lucas from English Racing joining us. English Racing is a big name, particularly in the Mitsubishi tuning scene. It is a company that I looked up to when I was starting my tuning business, STM, back in the day. Not just because I was heavily involved in the Mitsubishi 4G63 drag racing world, but I really liked what they were doing. They have an amazing reputation. We got the chance to sit down with Lucas and talk about 4G63s versus 4B11s. Lucas and English Racing have what at the time of recording is either the second or third fastest late model Evo with their Evo 8, around about a 7.70, 192 mile an hour. And their Evo 10 is currently the fastest in the world. So we got the opportunity to talk to Lucas about what makes these cars so fast. And it's really interesting because we get into the detail that as a casual observer, maybe looking at the four-wheel drive fastest drag racing lists or social media, you just don't get to learn about, particularly around launch strategies, how Lucas is getting these cars to 60 foot, his use of the electronic or drive-by-wire throttle body in order to control boost and control the launch, controlling torque, reducing clutch slip, and a host of other aspects. We also talk about launch strategies in terms of using the wastegate, fuel cut, ignition cut, and a bunch of other stuff. How to keep a 4G63 engine together, pros and cons of billet blocks versus cast, and of course the debate, the 4B11 versus the 4G63, which one is better? So any Mitsubishi fans out there are going to get a huge amount of information out of this podcast. But if you're just interested in learning how cars go so quick on the drag strip, there's still some great takeaways in there too. Before we get into that, I just wanted to talk about a social media post we put on our Instagram a little while back, which is relevant to today's topic. And if you're not following us on social media, make sure you do. We are HPA 101 on Instagram. So this was a photo we took a while back now at World Time Attack in Australia, and it is of a billet engine block. This one specifically is a 2JZ block. However, Bullet Race Engineering, who made that block, also make 4G63, SR20, and a host of other blocks. Every time we mention this, there's the age-old debate comes up. Well, is it really a 4G63/2JZ/ insert your favorite brand of billet block here when it's no longer a factory component? And I mean, yes, there's an argument for that, but at some point with particularly the likes of the 2JZ and RB boys and girls there pushing 2,000 plus wheel horsepower, at some point the factory block is just no longer strong enough. Now, I know that it seems pretty self-explanatory that the billet block is going to be stronger, but there are some other benefits that maybe aren't quite so obvious. One of the ones that Lucas talks to us today about is the actual weight saving, and that's actually one of their prime drivers behind going to the billet block in their Evo 8. Off the top of my head, I think he said that they saved around about 70 or 80 pounds of weight, which is pretty significant, and it's actually quite a cost-effective way of doing so. Another aspect there is, while the block is stronger, yes, one of the big problems we see in small capacity engines running a lot of boost pressure is head gasket sealing. It's another topic we talked to Lucas about today, but one of the benefits with going from a factory cast block to a billet block is we end up with a much thicker deck surface, which is the surface of the block where the head gasket seals to the cylinder head. The thicker that surface is, the more rigidity it has, the less it's likely to move under very high cylinder pressure. So it actually is a massive benefit in sealing the cylinder head onto the block. At least in my own experience with our drag racing program, the head gasket sealing was really the limiting factor there. So if you're not following us on social media, make sure you do so. We try and put out some really interesting information just about every day of the week. Now, if you haven't heard of HPA before, High Performance Academy, we are an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to tune engines, build engines, and also build quality, reliable wiring harnesses. Relevant to today's topic, if you are a 4G63 fan and you're interested in building your own engines, we have our practical engine building course. And by the time this episode airs, we'll also have a complete worked example on the 4G63. So it leverages heavily on my own experience building world record holding 4G63s, and it takes you through the HPA 10-step process. This is a simple step-by-step process that you can apply to building any engine. The specific worked example then goes ahead and applies that obviously on the 4G63. This is an Evo 9 engine, but it's going to be applicable almost irrespective of what model 4G63 you're building. And as a special bonus, you can use the coupon code podcast75. That's going to get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. And we'll drop a link in the description that you can follow to grab that course and get your $75 off voucher. All right, enough talking though. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the podcast. Lucas, thanks for joining us. Now, the English racing name is one that's been around for a fairly long time, and I know when I got involved in the 4G63 platform, it was a very, very well-respected name. Still is, let's be honest. But can we maybe get a really quick history on how you got involved in racing, tuning, engine building, etc., and maybe how English racing got formed?
Sure. So I guess that goes back early 2000s. I started, tuning, being a pilot since I was 16 with my dad, and that might have what got me into, understanding air fuel. Obviously an airplane, it's exhaust temperatures, but you're always tuning the airplane as you're going up in elevations. I would say in 2000 is when I got myself a 1992 Eagle Talon all-wheel drive, which had the 4G63 in it. And the addiction pretty much hit right there. It already had a 16G turbo on it. I put a Super AFC in it. Got what they called back then a pocket logger for data logging and seeing what knock is, and then just started breaking stuff. So I would, kind of raced, broke lots of transmissions. 2004 is when in 2003, I started fixing all my own transmissions, and then started doing transmissions for people locally, and then started my company officially in 2004. And we just started out of my garage at my house. We're technically still work out of a much bigger shop that's at my house, but it is in my backyard. And so it just started with it's been interesting for me. I've always been about the budget. How fast can you go for how little? So I guess a classic DSMer. And then somehow I've attracted customers that want the opposite of what I think is what we should be doing. So anyway, early on I was, I ran like a 12.3 at 110, and like my wife's with a stock 14B turbo, full weight. I did a lot of pump gas and methanol. So I used to actually do stock injectors on my Eclipses, and I would inject enough methanol to produce, 500 horsepower. And so I ran, high tens, I think 2006 or 7 in my Talon. And so that's where it started. I've had some good friends. TJ, that's been with me forever, started doing my motors. I taught him how to do transmissions, and our teams never looked back, I guess. So
the business has essentially evolved from a passion and grown around you as you've progressed?
Totally. Yeah. It's just about, the passion of the platform, and then, I guess I've always had a passion for keeping customers happy, which of course is highly frustrating in this industry, since I think the word I use would be professionally total cars for a living.
It can be challenging for sure.
Yeah.
Let's come back to your choice of the Talon Eclipse platform. Unfortunately, it's not a car that we actually ever got here in New Zealand. We were sort of blessed and cursed with the Japanese domestic market model. So essentially we had Galant VR4 and then moved into the Evo 1 to 3 and onwards and upwards from there. And when it comes to choosing a car at that level, I'm sure you had a bunch of options. So was there a specific strategy that took you down that path of the 4G63 Talon Eclipse, or is that just a lucky coincidence that you fell on your feet with that platform?
So I don't think it was completely lucky. I guess, the late 90s, I guess my good friend, brother-in-law, got like an 87 5-liter with some exhaust, so we burned lots of rubber and spun cookies for days and that. So I would assume that 5 liters what kind of really got the power bug. Of course, my first car out of high school was just like an 89 Accord, and I was like any dumb kid, I pulled the e-brake every second I could, and so I guess late 90s we did a LS swap into my buddy's CX Civic, which only ran a 14.9, but seemingly in 2000 that was pretty novel at that time. And then I guess I had a friend named Tom Hartshorn who started a shop called Stay Tuned, and he was, of course, a 4G63 guy. Anyway, he kind of had all the DSM lists and how fast it can go. So I guess talking to him one day at the shop and looking at what the car was capable of, it just seemed like that was a cool car to get, and it made sense. And so I went and found one and bought it, and then we were about ready to do a GSR swap into a 92 Civic hatchback. And, but either way, I bought the Talon and just, broke a lot of stuff.
I think it is safe to say the 4G63, though, to luck onto that platform, not discounting the other ones out there, but it has proven to be just about an infinitely tunable platform. And looking back at sort of when I first got into Evos and drag racing, I mean, everyone looks at what we did and thought that I had this long-term affinity to the Mitsubishi brand, but the reality was I was pretty analytical in my approach. I looked at the options that were four-wheel drive that we had easy access to in New Zealand, and it came down to the Evo 1 to 3 or the same generation at that time Subaru STI, and I looked at how many broken STIs I saw around and how fast the 4G63s were going, and that was really what I based my decision on. Not trying to knock the EJ series engine. I mean, those obviously can be built strong and powerful as well, but looking at the options, the 4G63 seemed like a no-brainer to me. Fast forwarding, obviously, you've now got a Evo 8 that somewhere either second or third fastest in the world with a 770 at, I think, was it 192 mile an hour. You've also got the fastest outright Evo 10 in the world running 790 at 185 mile an hour. So things have come a long way. Before we get into those two vehicles, you just mentioned that your Talon Eclipse had an SAFC or Super AFC in it. So a lot of our listeners probably have no idea what that unit is. And it's sort of a little bit laughable because I've seen a number of those come across my dyno back many years ago. I haven't seen one for a while, thankfully. But can you tell us what it is and how it works?
Sure. So, those cars, of course, we didn't have speed density. I guess if you were a baller, you would buy the HKS. Why can't I think of the name of that? So either way, I was the cheap guy. So you got your MAFs, you do a 2G MAF, or you take the 1G one and you chop it in half. And so when you start messing with the MAF, then of course that's what runs the car and the fueling. So the Super AFC, you connect the throttle position, you connect to in between the MAF signal, and then RPM of the engine, and you basically add or subtract MAF signal to get what you want. And so that can be a scary game in some of those cars. So if you did maybe injectors that were too big and then you had to pull out too much on the MAF, but in those times I didn't realize what load was necessarily in ECU. But of course nowadays, where an Evo 8 stock computer would be running, let's say, the 300 load area, we were probably pulling some of those Talons down into the 180s or something. So then, of course, ignition timing would be through the roof. So basically, the Super AFC, you're just fiddling with the with the MAF signal.
Cheating the inputs to the factory ECU.
Yeah, to the factory ECU. Lying to it, exactly.
And I think that the part that a lot of people overlook, which you just mentioned there, it is easy to overlook when you're tweaking that load signal that the ECU is basing its fuel and ignition on. The ignition is also being altered, and when you cheat that by pulling that load signal down, it advances the timing. So a few engines have been damaged in that way. I assume you're running a good fuel, so that's how you could get away with this and get yourself a little bit more of a wider tuning envelope.
Yeah, I guess the methanol injection was popular back then. Some of them, like my wife's car I spoke of, we just stuck straight race gas in it and ran the timing. It was probably 30 some degrees or some crazy number, The other thing on the 1Gs obviously had an adjustable cam sensor. So you would literally just, base timing's 5, you might go 0 or -5 or do what it needed. So typically for me, I did a lot of street tuning back in the day. You'd have a wideband, and then you'd have, I used the little pocket logger that would show me the knock, and honestly, that was very accurate, I feel like, and I'd go out, and if it's knocking, I would retard the timing. Yep. I also feel that a lot of older school tuners, that's where this thought that a richer air fuel ratio got rid of detonation, and I feel that a lot of tuners that came from back in the day didn't realize by running it richer that they were actually then running lower ignition timing. Right. And so then I know once you get up, I know the air fuel ratio is critical for a half mile and long pulls, but all of us tuners with dying fuel pumps have seen all kinds of stuff that, if you're at a 11.5 air fuel, you're not going to go to a 10.5 and miraculously get rid of detonation usually.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is, I haven't really sort of talked about that too much so far, but I mean, it is definitely something I hear talked about a lot. Well, we're rich in the air fuel ratio and that'll get rid of detonation. And I think exactly what you're saying there, 11.5 to 1 down to 10.5 to 1. Chances are you're going to just be pumping black smoke out the exhaust, and you'll fall off a cliff in terms of power. But there's levels to this stuff. Obviously, if you're on the knife edge, then yes, the air fuel ratio affects the combustion chamber temperature or combustion charge temperature, which in turn is going to influence detonation. But it's not how would you put it, not a silver bullet to fix knock, is it? Right.
Well, and to me, I guess if you're to the point in a pull where the richer air fuel is going to fix the motor, it's probably already fell apart or falling apart. It's not. I guess in my mind, it's first through third gear, you're probably not going to blow up a motor from air fuel ratio. You get the motor in the top of fourth gear, or especially half mile stuff, and then maybe the air fuel ratio could have an effect on the temperature. But ultimately, octane, boost, and timing are to me the absolute most critical. And air fuel ratio is definitely important, but it's not as important as those others.
Sure. Yeah, get the basics right, and obviously with these high boost, high power applications, specifically in a small capacity engine, octane is really your friend. You want as much of that on board as you can get.
Exactly.
All right, so the SAFC, as I say, I haven't seen one for probably the better part of a decade, and I'm not unhappy about that. They served a purpose, but it's kind of like, I would say, probably trying to perform brain surgery with a meat cleaver. It's a pretty brutal way of getting the job done, and it doesn't offer for a lot of finesse. Obviously, across your career, you've seen massive advances in electronics, particularly. So, how critical has the advances we've seen in the latest crop of engine management systems been, and you guys being able to do what you're doing now, setting world records on the quarter mile and half mile?
I guess it all just goes together, because obviously back when we were doing super AFCs, I mean, if you're making 350 wheel, you're pretty cool, and if you're over 400 wheel, you're maybe extra cool. So now, it's like normal is almost 500, and then I guess the extra normal might be 700 on a 4-cylinder, and then of course if guys are wanting to push limit to 1,000, so I guess I can't even think about trying to do what I do today on a Super AFC. I mean, if a Talon
No.
showed up with a 16G on it and some 550s and a MAF and a Super AFC, we'd probably get the job done fine. And that's a 320 horse car, and we're just barely playing with something. Of course, we don't do that here. We wouldn't touch an AFC because there's so many. You just have to, it's DSM link at a minimum if we're doing an Eclipse or whatever. So I would say it all, even our stock computers, we do, 800 horse on stock computers, but, we try to steer people to the standalones for the air fuel safeties and oil pressure safeties and, coolant temperature safeties and actual data logging. So if something breaks or goes wrong, they can actually send you something back, versus a stock computer. It might work fine on the dyno, and then the customer has a problem and they're like, well, you got to get the laptop out and you got to get, or get good with your SD card and your little Tiertrax cable. And so anyway, the standalones are definitely, in my opinion, if we're over 600 wheel, I'm definitely pushing a little harder for a standalone.
So the factory engine management will do it, but it's the additional, the logging and the safety parameters, really, that's your key advantage as you see it around that power level for the standalone.
Right. And then, of course, if you're really into drag racing, then, of course, I'm, a Motec fan all the way. And then there's, of course, launch leash strategies in there. And, of course, the drive-by-wire stuff. And so there's a lot of things that, sure, we can make the power on the dyno. We made 1,000 horse on a stock computer. And you can go out and roll race it. But you try to put that on a two-step and launch it and get stuff to work right, it's not going to probably work very well.
Yeah, I think the data logging as well, particularly when you're making that sort of power, and at least for the first half of the track, you probably got more power than you could put to the track, is all about sort of doing a pass and then looking at the data, figuring out how much more you've got up your sleeve in terms of traction, and then fettling the power delivery, which is not impossible to do on a factory engine management system, but definitely, again, it's kind of back to that meat cleaver analogy. You don't really have the finesse to do it to the same level you've got maybe with some of the smarter aftermarket standalone ECUs. And back when I used to even race I had a stock Evo 8 that made 522 wheel that ran like a 10.8 at 128 at 3,300 pounds on a stock turbo. Yeah.
And when I used to race that car, I actually would launch half throttle and then shift second half throttle and then floor at the top of second, when I was on the stock computer.
Just to do your own right foot power management.
Right.
Yeah. It's definitely, it's doable, but it's a hard way to get consistent passes when you're trying to manage it all with the right foot.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about your sort of moves into the more serious drag racing. I've briefly mentioned the two sort of cars maybe right now you're best known for. Let's start with the Evo 8, because that one's probably a little bit closer to my own heart, given that we did back in the day build a car that held the late model Evo world record, albeit well and truly eclipsed now by a number of cars. So what does it take to get a 4G63 powered Evo 8 into the sevens?
Well, you definitely have to have a beer can of a car, I feel like. So light. Mm-hmm. Horsepower-wise, 1,300 horsepower is kind of where we're at. Of course, partially because we can't, our biggest nemesis has been our 60-foot, trying to get the car to launch smooth. Yeah. And, obviously if we can someday, get our 60-foots into the low 1.2s or high 1.1s, then of course, just 11, 12. But right now we're having to back half the cars a bit, which just put the power down to kind of drive around our lack of a 60-foot, which we're hoping that we've been making a lot of changes there and doing testing this last year. So I'm hoping this World Cup we might be able to look pretty a lot better in that department.
All right, so you just dropped a bunch of terms that probably those who aren't heavily involved in drag racing will have no idea what we're talking about. So first of all, a lot of people looking at it would be thinking, well, if you want to go faster and quicker, well, just add power. And well, yes, that works to a point. And if you want to run in the sevens, you're going to need a lot of power, as you just mentioned. But it's that challenge about getting the car to the 60-foot, which, as its name implies, is a marker or timer that is 60 foot from the start line. And kind of we use that as a bit of a line in the sand, as how well the car is leaving the line and getting its power down. Now, I always worked on the basis, and it's probably only a rough rule of thumb, but if you can pick up 1/10 of a second to the 60 foot, so in other words, get the car from leaving the start line to that 60 foot 1/10 of a second quicker, basically that's going to give you about 2/10 at the end of the track. Does that sort of work with what you see?
I would say so. I think I've even heard people say 3/10, but definitely 2/10. So I would agree with that for sure.
So the key point there is it's a much easier way to get a quicker ET, to get the car out to the 60 foot faster or quicker than it is to try and do it down the deep end of the track, but where you're trying to hit it with a big old sledgehammer with a heap of power.
Right. And so that's where the weight also is so critical, because like when we first started racing the 10, it was full weight. And of course we didn't have the transfer case control or the ACD, which is what kind of the 10 doesn't have a viscous coupler that locks the front to rear. Sure. And so anyway, like our first time at World Cup, I think we broke 3 rear ends and 1 transfer case, and so, but seemingly getting these cars lighter, a lot of those failures seem to get further and further away from, they don't happen near as often. So.
All right. So let's come back to sort of talking about this relationship between power, which we need for the deep end and the big mile an hour. But we go too far with that side of things, with too big a turbo, that makes the car harder to get out of the hole, harder to launch, and that hurts that 60 foot. So can you tell us why it's not a case of just slapping the biggest turbo we can find in the catalogue on the engine and sending it?
Right. So that's, I think, the biggest nightmare for everybody, which I'm probably going to have a lot of good things to maybe educate some people on in this area. So one of the things that, you notice, especially World Cup finals, a lot of people have, a lot of valve issues, cylinder issues. Like you walk down through the World Cup finals race and, many of the imports will have the cylinder heads off every night. So obviously all the cars we run are a true twin scroll, which I've learned from dealing with Jeff Bush's automatic Eclipse back in the day, that the twin scroll in the third gear side by side, you can't hardly tell a darn difference with it. And of course, even once you're revving it out, banging gears, you can't tell a difference. But you give twin scroll an extra 4 or 5 seconds, it does things at lower RPM that you might not known was possible. So like Jeff Bush's Eclipse, it was a single scroll tile on the automatic. We were having to try to hold it back at almost 6,000 RPM, which, if you know anything about DSM automatics, that's really a challenging RPM to be at. Then you got a lot of nitrous going on. And when we went to the twin scroll in that car, we were able to produce 50 pounds of boost at 3,800 RPM.
Okay, so that's just as a result of the way the exhaust gas is introduced to the turbine wheel with the twin scroll versus a single entry turbo.
Right, but it just, most of the time people think twin scroll spools faster, and I would say most manual transmissions on the street, if you put it in fifth, it'll spool way sooner. But if you're banging some gears, you can't, usually the twin scroll hurts top end power by a decent amount, and you can't tell a difference. So one of the things I also feel, we come back to talk about anti-lag. I guess I'll start out with, first thing, I'll talk about wastegate stuff. So I'm a big proponent of the wastegate on a small import engine to be closed. And a lot of these cars on the anti-lag will do boost control at the line using the wastegates.
Yep.
And I've even done, back in the day of that little automatic, I had a little automatic Eclipse that ran, 960 on a 16G.
Okay.
So amazingly fast. And I did some interesting tests on that, because trying to hold that car back on the whip at the line and the toot was really a challenging thing, because it would just want to yard through the brakes. It was a stock stall converter car. Sure. And I did a test on that where I took the wastegate line and I had it on a wastegate line at 10 pounds, and I actually ran a T into the cab, and I actually had my finger on the wastegate line. And the second I let off the brake, I just let off the wastegate line. So I went from 10 pounds to pulled wastegate line. Okay. Car's dramatically slower. Anytime you have big wastegate changes where it has to essentially kind of respool the turbo, you've we're really taking a lot of power away. So that's where we come into this throttle thing that's pretty key to my system. So I feel if we're on an anti-lag system, if you start getting over, so let's back up. If I'm on gas or ethanol, I'll use a fuel cut strategy. So I'll do a fuel cut first before the ignition. And I find that creates a nice crispy car. But you start getting over 25, 30 pounds of boost on an ignition-based anti-lag, and it's really just a flooded out, pissed off engine. And so then a lot of these guys you'll see at the track, I mean, they're launching at 8,000. They're just at crazy RPM, and they're just driving around an engine that's flooded out, in my opinion. Like, it sounds cool as shit at the line. Sorry, I probably shouldn't say that. But it's really not. And then, of course, and if you think about it, some of these cars are building 30, 40 pounds of boost. When you look at your injector duty, you're sitting there at 40, 50% injector duty, and you're producing 0 horsepower.
Sure.
Right? So you're just
a
really
massive amount of fuel just running through the engine.
Through the engine. And so, we're able to, my strategy on methanol, of course, as I do the ignition cut, but once I approach about 25 pounds of boost, I actually start closing my throttle.
Okay.
And so then and then of course the second the car moves, then my throttle will go to where I want it to go. So my cars, the Evo, when I ran the 770 in the Evo 8, we were launching at 5,500 RPM, and it comes out like a stock turbo.
Okay.
Right.
All right. So again, you just dropped a whole bunch more information in there that I think we need to go back and unpack. So first of all, just really quickly for those who haven't sort of schooled themselves up on what this anti-lag is, I call it two-step with drag racing. It kind of just gets away from that confusion about a rally style anti-lag, which is off throttle. So we use this when the driver's traditionally at the start line at full throttle, clutch in, and we're using ignition retard and fuel, or ignition cut, or sometimes both, in order to basically spool the turbocharger, because we're getting combustion effectively occurring in the exhaust system. So that drives the turbocharger, which is how we can get these massive turbos producing 20, 30, 40 psi of boost when the car's not moving. So just to clear that up. Now I want to talk about the different strategies with fuel cut and ignition cut, because it's interesting that you said you're using fuel cut in some of the fuels you're using. You're still using an ignition cut as well, because my own experiments with this is that if you need to spool a big turbocharger and provide a lot of energy, the ignition cut is hugely more effective, because we do actually need the unburned fuel and air going through into the exhaust system. So how are you are you still using some ignition cut?
So I would agree, like in the Haltex I've dealt with and stuff, that anytime I try to bring the fuel cut in, it just kills the heat. You don't get the spool. But for some reason on the Motec, I guess I might have to look closer. However it does its randomizer, like I'll set the fuel cut at it's a number of 100. So once I go 100 RPM, I guess above my target RPM, it'll start the fuel cut, and then I can start the ignition cut 500 above. But it actually still functions, like it still builds boosts, and I guess I'd have to look closer to see where the ignition. I know that when I try to bring the two together, like let's say I try to put a fuel cut on top of an ignition cut, that typically creates explosions that are not nice. Like it seems like I have to be one or the other. So trying to bring it in. So either way, however the Motor Tech does its strategy, seemingly I can, let's say, set my fuel at 100 and I set my ignition at 500, and it and it pulls its timing and it just does its job. And it sounds normal. So
now, you just mentioned there as well about it's not nice on the engine, some of these big explosions, and that's another point I think a lot of people overlook. It sounds cool as hell when you've got a car there popping and banging on the two-step limiter and flames are coming out the exhaust. But the bit that's easy to overlook is that's creating, depending on how aggressive that strategy is, it's creating huge pressure spikes in the exhaust manifold between the turbine wheel and the exhaust valves, and particularly with an engine that in stock form uses hydraulic lifters like the 4G63, that in and of itself can be problematic. So can you just talk us through about some of the downsides that you can see with that?
So on the 4G63, I guess I have if right now, for keeping rockers on, if I'm over, let's say, 40 pounds of boost, I don't allow our car to hit a rev limiter except for the shift cut. So it seems like if you're under 30 pounds of boost, your rockers will stay on. But you start getting 40, 50 pounds of boost and you're driving. So if you're thinking, oh, I don't want to rev my engine high, let's make the rev limiter, 9,700. Well, if you're at 70 pounds of boost and you drive a 4G63 straight into a 9,700 RPM rev limiter, your rockers are just coming off.
Yeah.
And so, now we have the rev limiters at like 12,000, and then I actually I close the throttle at 11,000.
So finding a softer way to limit the engine speed.
And I think that, the Evo 10, of course, it doesn't have rockers to chuck, but I think all of these engines, when people are losing compression and they're losing valves, they're all battling the same issue. It just happens a 4G63 chucks a rocker off when it gets into that spot.
And essentially, for those who maybe aren't quite following along there, what you're getting is these limiters. You've got fuel and ignition cut. Again, you get that situation where you can potentially have an explosion occur in the exhaust manifold. The pressure then can overcome the valve springs on the exhaust side and actually pop an exhaust valve back open, which can have pretty nasty consequences. If you're really unlucky, you could tag the piston, but in most instances, you end up with a situation where that rocker pops off, which you've just mentioned. The hydraulic lifters, you're probably not running them at that level, but a minimum, the lifter's also going to pump up, and then you lose all compression on that cylinder, even if the rocker stays on. Is that?
Yeah, we are actually. We might have just went to solid, but we've actually been doing hydraulic, but we've been plagued by rocker issues.
Sure.
And one thing that I remember talking to Kigley Racing, he has a fast front wheel drive 4G63, kind of a, he does the automatic stuff, but he's done some, he's kind of an engineering type guy. And I think he wanted to tell me that sometimes explosions can be as high as 300 and some PSI in the exhaust manifold. So then it doesn't matter what valve spring you have or what, nothing, which
You're not overcoming that.
Because we started out at 90 pounds of seat pressure, and we've been up to 150 pounds of seat pressure, and all kinds of different things. And it just seems like when you get up into that high boost level, high power level, and then you're running all over rev limiters, it ends up being a bad deal.
Yeah, definitely. And I think any time you can stay away from a limiter, that's going to be beneficial, and a bit of that is your tuning strategy, but a lot of that also goes down to educating the driver, particularly if you're tuning for a customer. Just sending it out the door with a 12,000 RPM rev limiter without a bit of driver education might also not end that well.
Well, I think honestly though, with the way I do the tuning on the Motec, I try to take everything away from the driver, because even the best of us can do something wrong. So either way, I have the throttle will shut down. The other thing on the Motec that I realized was a feature is kind of I'll call it a stupid rev limiter, but it has an engine warning. And so I can basically say if I hit 11,000 that the engine won't turn back on until 8,000 or 9,000. And so rather than it just sitting up there bumping off a crispy rev limiter, it's just going to shut off essentially. And
so like someone turned the key off.
Right. And so I think I've been kind of implementing that feature into some of, because I do a 600, actually I think we did almost 700 horse Hayabusa drag ATV that I tuned that's had valve problems throughout the years.
Okay.
And so we've implemented, because he doesn't have drive-by-wire, so I've implemented that strategy into his. So.
All right, so let's come back, and we'll sort of keep coming full circle here, but you've dropped a hell of a lot of information I just want to cover off. So you've talked about not using the wastegate on the exhaust during that launch phase, and you're building boost and then keeping the exhaust wastegate closed and controlling the boost with the throttle position. Back in the day, I did some experimentation, so we found that if you're using a two-step strategy, particularly one with the ignition cut, you tend to, it's effective, but if you're trying to control the boost with the wastegate, you tend to get this sort of oscillation in the boost pressure. So it can be oscillating 2 or 3 PSI, which makes it very difficult when you drop the clutch on a high versus a low. That's a hell of a lot of difference in the engine power. So consistency takes a hit. So we went to the blow-off valve, wastegate mounted on the charge plumbing instead, which tended to be a bit smoother. So the electronic throttle, better again?
I haven't used it on the wastegate pipe. So basically our wastegate, I try to also have as I start to build boost, I'm actually adding timing. So I might pull 30 degrees of timing to get things going in a hurry. And then once I get up about 15 to 20 pounds, then I'll be down to like 0 degrees of timing. So nothing crazy. And then I just it's a simple table. It has vehicle speed that John Reed writes. So it's vehicle speed across the top and it's boost to the left. And then I have a throttle position in the middle.
Okay.
Or is the data table. And so, we're 100% throttle until probably 15 pounds. And then I go, 90, I'd say by 20 pounds, I'm down to 70% throttle. And then that's definitely a tuning thing you have to play with, because if you start if you chop the throttle too much, then it'll start chasing your tail. But most of our cars are leaving on like 45 to 60% throttle is about the happy spot. And it's pretty darn smooth. I've also had different ECUs in a way they do two steps in the past, like, AEM, like, Series 2 AEMs and stuff that just aren't as smooth as the Motec is anyway. So the Motec, for me, has been a much smoother ECU. Everything stays pretty darn stable.
Yeah, I do think it's worth mentioning here that, and this isn't an ad for Motec necessarily, I'm not saying they're the only ones who have got this right, but it is very easy to look at a feature list when you're shopping for ECUs and go, it's got a two-step or anti-lag launch control strategy. Obviously that's all they need. But when you actually start getting down into the nitty-gritty, and particularly when you're dealing with cars that are operating at this level, you start to find that not all these features are created equal, and some definitely either offer more flexibility to the tuner, which again is important, or just simply are more refined in the way they get the job done, which again just allows you to do a better job. In terms of that launch strategy, so for you as the tuner, are you basically looking at your logging from how the car launches and then adjusting that throttle position versus vehicle speed target table to try and get as much power to the track as possible without sort of driving it straight into wheel spin?
Well, we have so obviously I 2 years ago when we were at World Cup finals, I actually was not on our dev. So in the Motec, you can have off-the-shelf what they call packages. Yeah. So and not every Motec, unfortunately, is created equal. Okay, so they all can have different features. And of course, we have John Reed Racing is who does our dev packages, as we call them. So then if I have an idea, he can implement it.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of his ideas, like if you were to buy his off-the-shelf package, what he has is throttle position versus boost error.
Okay.
And that gets a little more, but it'll do the same job that I'm doing. So he basically took my idea there, and then that's how he implemented it in for all of his regular customers and then my customers. I currently don't have any of my, I guess that Brandon Huntley's Subaru, that 880 TX2K. So I have a Subaru that's using.
I think we did a video on that on our YouTube channel.
Yeah.
If people want to find out more about that.
So either way, it's from a tuner, that took me a little bit to get that. It's doing the same job in a different way, but to make sure you aren't chasing your tail. So I think I just got off track, though. We were talking about the Motec, the different packages. What was the question, I guess?
We're probably just mentioning, I'll just put a nice little ribbon around that. So the Motec M1 ECU, you could kind of consider it as just a box of electronics, and it will do whatever it's programmed to do. So Motec, of course, offer their own, what they call firmware packages, which tells the ECU how to operate. And then you've got other developers like John Reed Racing. They do production firmware where they've come up with a feature that they think might work better than how Motec envisaged. And then the third option there is, as you've called it, a dev package or development package where you can write custom firmware. So I just wanted to clear that up.
I think so where we were going now is controlling power in first gears. So I have a couple things there. So one is, like we only run 60% throttle through first gear. So I guess that's my form of horsepower control. The other thing on the Motec that I'm using is a feature called race time. Mm-hmm. And so once I achieve 5 miles an hour vehicle speed, a timer starts, and then I have a rev limiter that I've created based off of that time. And that's where I got myself in trouble a couple years ago, though, is I wasn't having my normal throttle control. We were going 51 pounds of boost in first gear, and I was just smashing that rev limiter like nobody's business. And then, of course, the rockers were not appreciating that. And so So either way, that was so typically I always start off though, I guess, like when I first was running, I think 8.0 in the Evo 8, we were 50% throttle through first gear and then 60% throttle in second gear. And then I kept just giving a little more until and even those last 770s I ran, there was too much power in first and second. Like the car was getting pretty crappy. The other feature that we use some too is I have that throttle versus speed in there. Then I also have throttle versus gear. So I can do that. And then another feature that's pretty awesome in the 10 is if you are slipping the clutch and you're using the gear estimation, then as soon as the clutch slides, it'll fall to the default gear position. And so then I actually then have another throttle setting to kind of help control clutch slip. When it goes to default, then the throttle will blip down to like 50% for a second. As soon as it knows it's back in gear, then it'll pop back up.
Is that just to prevent it just burning straight through the clutch?
Well, when we ran the 790 in the Evo 10, we were right on the edge of if we got the clutch too hot, it wouldn't hold.
Okay.
And so then we were really in a predicament of, if we preloaded it, how we wanted to preload it at the line to get the launch we wanted, we got the clutch too hot, and then we'd grab second and it would just blow loose.
Okay.
And then we were getting where you dump the clutch, but then of course it's the car's hippity hops its way down the track. And so either way, that's something when we ran that 790 and the 10 that was, if you look at the data log, throttle went full for a second, and then you saw that it slid the clutch, throttle went to 50% for, maybe not even a second. And then the clutch grabbed, said it was in second gear, and the throttle popped back open.
Yeah. So again, I think it's just, this is the sort of stuff that people don't get to hear about, the little tricks that go on behind the scenes to actually get these cars to go down the track and do the times they're doing. Yeah. Now, a casual observer is probably asking themselves right now, well, if you can't put 51 PSI of boost to the track in first gear, why aren't you just running less boost? I mean, that's the obvious question, surely. What do you say?
That is a good question. So a lot of these precision turbos we run, depending on the turbo kit design, it's really challenging to get the boost control you want. Mm-hmm. I would say some of my this car I drive was owned by a former shop manager named Atif, who I guess I'm a conservative guy, so I've had customers actually show up with Wastegate's welded clothes on me and stuff, so then I don't have a choice. So I would say, in reality, we ultimately have a bad wastegate design that we don't have big enough wastegates, or else, our direction of piping, but it just seems all these cars I deal with, 50 pounds of boost as low as they go.
Yeah, okay.
Which is kind of why we chuckle when it says it's on a wastegate line sometimes, because what does that mean?
I think one of the strategies that I always try to employ, though, as well, and you might be completely in disagreement here, when you start to get to these bigger turbochargers, they have a lot of inertia, even with ball bearing units. You're battling that inertia. So if you had a situation where the car could leave hooked up with maybe 20 PSI, that'd be fine. And then you get to third gear and all of a sudden it's going to take 50 or 60 or whatever it is. Right. And that's going to be a huge amount of time when that turbocharger has to spool up from 20 PSI up to 50 plus. Right. So my strategy was always to leave the line with the turbocharger basically making as much boost as I wanted when the car was hooked up, and then control the power management through first and second where it wasn't, so that basically we, as soon as you, in your case, put all the throttle back into it, we were using a lot of ignition retard through particularly second gear, put the timing back in it, and then it's straight away hooked and you've got that boost. So I personally found that was an effective strategy. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, the timing's fine, but of course that can drive boost levels even higher.
It's a catch-22.
Right, so you're kind of going in circles there. And then I guess, it might have been a little bit of an accident, with all these turbos that run more boost than they should in these different gears, and me creating my throttle strategy. And of course, then I come back to that conversation of just lots of wastegate movements seem like they can hurt power. And then of course, if you're trying too hard, like the Evo 10, for example, we just did a little bit bigger ignition system on it, but that car, if I go too much back pressure, it's real misfire happy car.
Sure.
So I found that, just running 50-some% wastegate duty is just a happy spot for that car. Yep. And so you start sawing that wastegate duty around. But of course, I would say that some of these cars, maybe you would say middle of second gear, you would try to then run more boost. But unfortunately, every car I touch has turbos that run more boost than they're supposed to.
Yeah. Unfortunately, back here in New Zealand, and I don't think it's changed yet, the drag racing fraternity here were a bit gun shy of electronic throttle bodies, and essentially the ruling was, unless the car came equipped from the factory with drive-by-wire throttle cable, it was. So unfortunately, I never had that tuning tool in my arsenal when we were drag racing my Evo 3. But yeah, given the experience I have with drive-by-wire now, I'd have one in a heartbeat if it was on offer.
I guess for me, the drive-by-wire was really, I was tuned one of the first Motec GTRs, and of course the Motec does all torque control. And if the Motec's set up right, you can literally have boost control only the top port, pulled wastegate line on the bottom, 40-pound springs in it, and it'll just seamlessly, if it can't use the turbo to control boost, it'll just seamlessly move to the throttle. And so I can take a 2,500 horse GTR and I can literally make it 200 horse, and you could drive it around a road course.
Yeah.
And have the wastegates closed. And so, of course, and on the GTR, you have torque at the line, you have torque in each gear, then you have the transition of torque. And so then just seeing how that throttle worked really kind of just got my head spinning, and of course John Reed doesn't have a torque system like the GTR does, but of course I've created these systems that work how I want them to.
You're kind of just in a roundabout way getting a torque-based model almost, where the GTR package, you literally can ask for a specific amount of torque. You're just achieving that aim in a different way using your throttle opening.
Exactly. So
just coming back to getting these cars to 60 foot, and the power delivery and the throttle control is one thing, but one of the issues we sort of see is with a four-wheel drive car, getting that balance between the car bogging on the line when the driver gets off the clutch and basically just jumping straight into wheel spin. That's really hard, and you're walking a bit of a tightrope there to try and balance those two. Is there anything you're doing with slipper clutches or clutch slipper units to try and achieve a consistent result there?
Yes, we're all over the place. So I guess at the beginning of this year, looking at how the Subarus launched, one of our theories, and it works well, is just flat out a shorter first gear.
Sure.
So the Evo 10, we just went to where we have to shift fifth and a quarter. So so we did that strategy on the 10, which is successful. The newest one, I guess, it's a product called the Clutch Tamer, and of course they call it the Hitmaster. We just did testing on that with the 10, and I'm pretty excited. So the battle we run into with these all-wheel drive, so when you look at it like these new all-wheel drive Hondas, that's a front-wheel drive car with rear-wheel drive assist.
Yeah.
Or you look at a GTR, it's the inverse of that. It's a rear-wheel drive car with front-wheel drive assist. And of course, so those cars can kind of, blow the tires loose, and then the all-wheel drive helps them. But of course, in the case of the Evo, it really is a 50-50 continually variable style car. So the power goes to the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
So on a prep track, you either got to slide the clutch, and you actually don't get if you get wheel spin, either you're hitting it so hard that I guess you're going to get it. But if you're in that fine zone, the car just hops horribly. The power's jumping front to back, and it's just, it's horrible. And so, so right now this Clutch Tamer, we're pretty excited. Of course, today on the dyno, we just did the pure slipper clutch on that Evo 8, and it has the weights and all that. And of course, he set it up how I dreamed it should have been set up a year ago, which my fear right now with it is it'll work how we want, but I'm afraid that the clutch is going to be too high in maintenance, and we can't swap the thing between rounds. So to actually use the slipper feature is a challenge.
Let's just break that down again for those who aren't maybe drag racing aficionados. So a slipper clutch is or slider clutch as they're often called. That's what you'll see on like a proper rear-wheel drive drag car with a drag racing transmission, and it's got a combination of adjustable base pressure and then these centrifugal weights. So by adjusting those, I'm trying to give the really short version here, basically you can get a controlled and defined amount of slip when the driver sidesteps the clutch. So it's all about sort of controlling the relationship between wheel speed and engine RPM, keeping the engine RPM in its sweet spot without just blowing the tyres off and going straight into wheel spin. But as you mentioned there, they're high in maintenance, and you'll see the teams running those sorts of cars. After every pass down the strip, the clutch will be out of the car, transmission out, and they have to reset that base spring, maybe grind the clutch plates and reset this or adjust the centrifugal weights as needed. So huge amount of work goes into setting those up. The clutch tamer, and I think if it's what I'm thinking, it's probably a similar system to we ran on our old Evo 3. You're talking here just about a hydraulic sort of hydraulic release valve that controls the rate at which a conventional hydraulic clutch is allowed to engage.
No, this is much. It's actually like a regulator, and so I'll talk about the Evo 10 because right now the numbers in the slipper clutch are pretty crazy. So basically, you push a clutch down, it goes 700 psi of clutch pressure, 680. Then when we start to preload at the line, we're down to about 650 psi. So at that point, though, we dump the clutch, and then I have the clutch chamber tuned to where it stops the clutch at 525 psi every time.
Okay.
Then at 10 miles an hour, that dumps again.
Right. So you've got real fine control over how the clutch is engaged in steps.
Right. And the problem with the slipper, like the Magna slipper that we used, is to get it to launch smooth, it's just slow because it's just letting the clutch out too slow. Yep. Unless you really put a ton of preload into it to where you're like basically burning, 200 or 300 horsepower down at the line, and then the slip ratio might be correct. And then also the other issue with a lot of those is they're highly affected by temperatures. So if you're out in a 70-degree day and then all of a sudden you come around to a 50-degree night, you're continuously screwing with this valve. So right now, from what we can tell with this clutch tamer, the Hitmaster, is it's like an actual, like a big fuel pressure regulator or something. When you dump it, it goes at 525. So we were able to cut 3 or 4 back-to-back low 360 foots out of the Evo 10 maybe a month ago with this. Okay. And and it's very, seemingly we can tune it. And of course we're logging the fuel pressure. And so we're excited about that product. The other thing is, since I do have our cars launching at such a low RPM, if we were on, we're on like 7685s, on these cars, which is really a pretty darn responsive turbo for the size, but of course, if we go to 8385s or 8685s, then of course we're on a whole nother plane. So I feel for what our cars are doing currently that we don't need the maintenance of a true slipper clutch. Sure. But if we end up going to a 8685 someday and we have to launch the car at 7,000 RPM or 8,000 RPM, then of course the slipper clutch would be the ticket.
And it sort of comes back full circle to what I was saying. The turbo sizing, it's not just a case of putting the biggest, baddest turbo on it, because that then has a knock-on effect to what you have to do in order to launch the car. Right. And while, yes, you might be making an extra 200 horsepower at the wheels just purely if you look at the dyno numbers, right, it can be hard, if not impossible, to actually get that represented in an ET in a mile an hour if you cannot get the thing to 60 foot anymore. Right.
Yeah, I think... like back in the day when we had an 83, 85 on the 10 for a second, I mean, you would shift that 9,900, 10,000 RPM and the thing would lose, even on a full throttle, strain gauge shift, it would lose like 20 pounds of boost on the shift. Yeah. Or you would get just a singular misfire and it would lose 10 or 15 pounds. Like it was crazy, we're like the 7685, we've ran the 6785, which is that True Street class turbo, and it's an amazing, I think very responsive for the power they make. Sure. So, yeah.
All right, let's just talk a little bit about the differences between the 4G63 and the 4B11. Obviously, the fundamental differences there, the 4B11 gone from a cast iron block to alloy. It's pretty common just about with any current generation engine, and complete redesign of the whole engine, including the cylinder head, which is now dual Mybec or dual continuously variable cam control. So at a high level, what do you sort of take away as the pros and cons of the 4B11 versus the 6.3?
There's definitely a lot of pros and cons, and man, I like the 4B11. Assuming the 4G63 does, pound to pound for boost, combo to combo, it makes more horsepower.
Mm-hmm.
But the 4B11 seems like it has a wider power band, probably because of the Mybec, how it's functioning. To me, the head gasket, once you sleeve a 4B11 properly, we do. Actually, I know we did Golden Eagle sleeves forever, and I don't know if we've changed to Darton does some of our sleeves also. So either way, I won't go. But either way, once you go to a sleeve and you do the right step of the sleeve, then I could argue that it's better than a 4G63 in that aspect, because a 4G, seemingly most of our 4Gs that get, even past 900 to 1,000 horsepower, they're not wet blocks anymore. The blocks are completely filled. We only have coolant running through the cylinder head. Some of that comes back to what Palo was talking about in his, where like the head gasket can leak, but it doesn't turn into a full torch job. Because we're doing the copper and so like our Evo 10 at 1,200 some horsepower is still a fully wet block. I've never done a 4G63 at even above 1,000. I guess we have some cars, so probably 1,050 might be the highest I've ever gone on a wet block. 4G63. The 4G63 is plagued by oil pump problems at times. Like our 4B11 is still running a stock oil pump, and the way it's set up off the bottom, it's even if it ran dry, it's not like it's the 4G63 oil pump has the timing belt on it with auto load. So the second that pump gets pissed off, the whole engine's not very happy. So seemingly the oiling system, beginning early on, we had lots of valve problems, part of that was limiter issues. Part of that was like, manufacturers not having valve pockets right. Like, we do 1 mil over valves and then they only have the valve pocket, so of course any old schooler says, well, why don't you clay the motor, you moron? It's like, I don't know, I guess we didn't. So
it's always easy in hindsight.
Right. So either way, we started really claying the motors, running the camshafts through their position, and figured out the motors to where I really would. I can argue motors either way. I honestly don't feel like I could choose, but I even look at Miles's Integra motor in a Honda, I would say all three engines have their pros and cons. But I would say the rocker issue of the 4G630 is definitely a plaguing issue. Even it seems like everybody that races them deals with that issue from time to time.
It's definitely a problem with anything that runs a non-shaft mounted rocker. And I mean, again, you can argue pros and cons of a rocker valve actuation versus a direct bucket actuation. But for reliability, that bucket's probably not going to jump out of there anytime soon.
No. And, the only time we initially thought we were having bucket issues in the 10, and that was only because we were having valve contact to the piston, and then that of course was taking the buckets out. And so once we've got through that, the reliability of the 10's been pretty good for us. In a street car application, though, the motor does run a hotter exhaust temperature. It seems to be a little bit more of a meltdown happy motor. So a 4G63, it's pretty standard. You might blow a head gasket or you chuck a rod, and honestly, for me, it's pretty uncommon to melt a piston or anything in a 4G63. But I would say 4B11s, you can have cars that you've even detuned and you think you're good, and if the person essentially does a half-mile pull or something big in it, it can end up with melted spark plugs and stuff a little more problematic. But from what we're doing at the drag strip right now, other than I guess the 10 is being a heavier platform, of course our Evo 8 is extremely light. I guess the partner in the car, it's kind of a confusing subject, but he spent a lot of money on titanium and billet pieces and all kinds of stuff on that car, where the 10 is slowly getting there.
Now, just in terms of that MyVec or the continuously variable cam control, so I mean, definitely in a street form, continuously variable cam control does provide an unarguable wider power and torque band than fixed conventional timing. But the flip side of that is quite often when we go to the sort of cam profiles, the added lift and duration that we see in an all-out drag application where we might be operating the engine between maybe 8 and 10,000 RPM, there's two sort of side effects with that. One is often it limits or eliminates the ability to swing the cam the amount that a normal continuously variable cam control system would. And then secondly, because while you actually have mentioned you launch these cars really low, so I'll get your take on it in a second. Normally, if you're operating only over a 2 or 3,000 RPM rev band, the actual benefit of that MyVec is somewhat diluted anyway. So are you still retaining the MyVec control in the drag application?
I mean, by 7,000 RPM, we have it fully retarded, or the advance is to 0. So we're really only using it to spool. I have data logs that people wouldn't believe from the 10 where the car's bogged to like 2,700 RPM and is still maintaining 33 pounds of boost and still runs a low 8.
That's, you don't normally hear that.
Right. So, I think, but I've also, as a tuner, have spent a lot of time where I guess that my tunes are pretty crispy in those areas, if I use that for a better term, where I've really got them. I guess I focused really hard on that one. I just seemingly the low RPM I felt like was the ticket, and of course our 60 foots weren't quite as good as some, but I mean, man, I feel like we had some pretty darn good reliability. It might only be low 1.4 60 foots. Of course now we're into the 1.3s with these new little products that we're using.
Sure.
But either way, that's so.
Yeah, so you're still relying on that, and it is showing you a big advantage, as you've basically explained. Next topic I want to talk about is head gasket reliability, which is a topic that is unfortunately near and dear to my heart. That kind of for us with our 63 program was always the kind of the fuse really limiting the amount of power that we could make.
Right.
Very seldom saw an actual mechanical failure, but keeping the head bolted soundly onto the block was always problematic. What techniques are you using in both of these applications?
I mean, right now we've all gone to the fire rings, so then it's a copper gasket that's really just out there with some special RTV to keep coolant from going where it shouldn't go, and oil. Yep. And then we have the rings in there with step height. I don't know all of our exact numbers on what the heights are. But so either way, the 4G and the 4B11 are all on the fire ring setup. Of course, our older 4G63 stuff, we used to use I think it was a 12 thou stainless wire in the block with a copper gasket and the receiver groove. Yep. And, every time you took those, we still melted and torched heads. Of course, you didn't know the head gasket was even leaking until you saw oil splattered on the firewall or something, Yeah. We also had to have a learning curve of, when people go to weld those heads, of course, making sure you put them in the oven and get them up to temp and they're using the right rod and all that to weld those heads. So I feel like, we've had plenty of head failures just from probably not welding up all the water ports correctly.
Yeah, fair enough.
And so either way, right now, the Evo 8, the Evo 10, of course, we started out with just a pretty big step. I want to say a 3,000 or 4,000 step and a stock head gasket, and that we made well over 1,000 horse on that. But now we have the fire ring set up in that, and then of course on the 4G63, we do some other we have some step washers we do into the head. Okay. So that way because a lot of times, you don't ever torque these things much past 90 some foot-pounds, usually because you're going to just be digging into the head. But these washers help, because even when you blow a head gasket, you pull all your nuts, you can tell where the washers have just been digging into the head. Yeah. So either way, we have a custom, our machine shop will drill out the head a little bit, and they're like a step washer that goes in there. So that's one thing we've done in the 4G63. So yeah, that's so the fire ring thing is seemingly the ticket for us these days.
So when you've got these fire rings doing the sealing, and I'm assuming you've got those set into a groove on the top of the block. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you find is that then a rock solid solution, or is it still something that you're kind of walking a bit of a fine line as to whether or not it's going to hold and needs consistent maintenance work?
I would say, we kind of, when it comes to the 4G and the 4B11, we kind of hit our numbers pretty quick. We had we had a GTR experience that made us work for it in getting that height correct.
Okay.
But either way, it's been, I think if you use the similar philosophy, anybody that's done stainless steel O-rings and heads before, you kind of know what you can and can't do.
Yeah.
So you're not really, it's nothing too crazy outside of that. I think the beauty of the fire ring too is it's just, you can do stainless rings in the head, MLS gaskets and receiver grooves, but you're still, is everything lining up how you think it should be lining up? Whereas
there's
if this
not a lot of room for error.
Right, and you can't, it's not like you're a tiny man that can climb in there and really see how it all went together, So then the fire rings are just sealing nice up against the head, and the head gaskets out there sealing the coolant and stuff. So, because we do a lot of our 4Gs, actually, we do like I think it's almost a 12 thou stainless wire in the head with an MLS gasket. Okay. And that's been really successful for our street cars. We kind of pushed, when we were starting to do a lot of 4G64s with 87 mil bores, there was no way to really get a good stainless wire into the block. And so then for how far it sticks out of the head, you'd think, well, how the hell does that even work? And it just does. Yep. So it doesn't seem to leak. And,
I think that's a pretty well trodden path for slightly lower power levels at this point.
Yeah.
All right. Last question I want to ask you here. We're going a bit long, so I'll try and keep this one brief. Okay. You mentioned that the Evo 8 you've moved recently to a billet block. And we've seen this has sort of taken the drag racing world by storm, billet blocks for just about all of the popular makes and model of engines. So can you give us your sort of rundown on at what power level with the 4G do you think the cast iron blocks really you're pushing the limits and the billet's the way to go?
I guess I don't have an opinion because I don't think we needed the billet block for power reasons. But the billet block, from understand, 70 pounds lighter, so it's actually the cheapest weight reduction mod we've done on the car in a long time. Like, I want to say there's almost $7,000 in titanium on the car that might only save X, billet steering racks, billet knuckles, so to just be able at this stage in the game when you're trying to chase weight, the billet blocks I was actually teasing my guy Atif. It's like, we should have done it's the cheapest weight savings you could have done. Yeah,
that's probably a side of it that most people wouldn't immediately consider. So no real necessity in terms of engine reliability. Does it aid maintenance?
I can't say at the moment. We really haven't ran that 8 enough to where I would have a maintenance program or anything to say. And then, honestly, head gaskets here or there, rocker issues, but half the time the head came off because the rocker came off and then it bent a valve or screwed up the head. So the head's coming off for that reason, nothing to do with horsepower.
Yeah, sure.
And we've never cracked a cylinder. So I would think that if we do chuck a rod, supposedly the billet blocks are somewhat salvageable, maybe, because you can weld them up and do some stuff.
Yeah. And individually replaceable liners as well.
Right, exactly. And so I'm assuming the head gasket's going to be better without a doubt on the billet block. But
you're sealing against a much thicker deck surface on that block as well.
Right.
Yeah,
but,
makes sense.
And also, it's kind of getting the 4G parts is just getting harder and harder.
Yeah.
So it's just something that you can buy and get. So that is another value.
Okay. All right, look, I think we'll wrap up here. We want to respect your time, Lucas, and we do appreciate everything you've sort of shared with us so far. We've got a couple of last questions that we always like to ask our guests, and the first of those is, given the experience you've had now and what you've achieved in the industry, if you were looking back at a younger version of yourself, just getting started and looking maybe to break out into the industry, is there any advice you would give to sort of fast track the career you've had?
I mean, it's a pretty challenging thing. Obviously, I've forgotten more than I know sometimes. So, but I guess, honestly, hard work, getting out there, being able to, I guess if you're wanting to be a tuner, obviously all your guys' programs are actually awesome. Like I listened to your diesel one a while back. Cool. I think I even paid you for it.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. And so, as I always tell people, if you got it and you're addicted to it, you're gonna do it.
Yeah.
And
I think passion can't be overlooked in this industry.
Right. And if you think it's fun and novel, but you're not doing it, it probably isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's, anyway, that's all I guess I can say.
All right. And last question for today. If people want to follow English Racing, how can they do so? Where are you on social media?
I guess Facebook is our most, so English Racing on Facebook is our most active. Mm-hmm. We do have a website, englishracing.net, but it's extremely outdated and we don't take care of it like we should.
Sure.
So, but either way, so I'd say Facebook, and then we do Instagram, of course, English Racing on Instagram. And then my Facebook is I pretty much have a Facebook addiction. So I'm always posting everything publicly. So I guess if you want to see everything from race cars to semi-trucks to airplanes to birds, I'm a pretty random guy.
More airplanes lately than race cars, if I had to be honest, which I'm not angry about. It's whatever I'm doing. Next week it'll be World Cup finals. Absolutely.
So there will be a lot of pictures and stuff up on that. So, but
all right. Well, that's probably a good segue to finish up with their World Cup finals coming up. Obviously, will have been run and done by the time this podcast actually makes it out, but should be a fairly intense lineup of cars there, and hopefully maybe you can go a little bit quicker with both the Evo 8 and the Evo 10.
Yeah, that's the dream, always is. So, and then hopefully maybe try to win a race too, but nobody seems to care about that anymore.
No, it's always the PBs, right? And the world records.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Send it, right?
All right. Thanks a lot for your time, Lucas. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.